Parliament's spring session is cranking along now, but the government hasn't exactly got a spring in its step so far. Last week brought the replacement of the Speaker, a replacement gay marriage policy for the Coalition and a replacement target for carbon cuts. But the latest Fairfax Ipsos poll suggests the same old attitudes persist about this government. It still trails Labor, although ministers remain steadfastly determined to persevere with their programs and their priorities.
The Coalition trails Labor by a significant amount. On a primary basis, it has the government at 38%, Labor at 36%, which translates into a two-party preferred vote of around 54 to 46.
The distraction of all of this and the commentary that goes around it, that happens from time to time.
Did it show that last week was a complete disaster for the government?
Look, I think it's hugely important that we focus on the things that matter to everyday Australians.
We can't focus on the polls. What we've got to focus on is the job of strengthening the economy.
I've got lots of very strong messages, and so do all my colleagues.
Well, the objective of the government is to focus on the things that interest the Australian people, and that it's, family,
well, that'd
domestic
be handy
violence.
if you told all members of the government, including Mr Turnbull, to pull their heads in, or someone did.
Well, I'll leave those things to the Prime Minister.
I've got a very strong message about how we've got more money for research and development so we can keep exotic pests out of this country.
How can you turn it around and make sure that that messaging is actually cutting through to the public?
Well, we continue to roll out our economic plan.
Bill has done an incredible job. In the past few weeks, Bill Shorten has been talking about the issues that matter.
Why don't you do this and say, Laurie Oakes was right on Saturday. If there's going to be a change of leadership, it's going to be me, not you. Pull your head in.
Well, there's not going to be one, and the Prime Minister has my full support, and that's the way it will remain.
There is absolute solidarity on issues and that's why we're standing behind the fact that we've got record prices in cattle. Did I tell you that? Record prices in cattle.
I'm not even going to talk about it.
Well, if he pulled his head in, we wouldn't have to talk about it.
Well,
and he's like a petulant child who got shown the door by the party, and he's been sour ever since.
I don't know what you're expecting me to say, Ray. I mean, I've made my point. I'm not going to indulge media speculation about this stuff.
So that's how the morning played out. Well, the polls are poor for the Coalition, just as they have been for well over a year now. And one question put in the latest poll shows majority support, again, for same-sex marriage. That lingers as a hot-button issue around the Parliament too. Warren Entsch, who triggered last week's extraordinary talks and policy shifts in the Coalition, finally got to introduce his private members' bill today. Not much will come of it in the foreseeable future, but he's not giving up either.
This bill is designed to promote an inclusive Australia, not a divided one. A divided nation is what we will be if we continue to allow discrimination in relation to marriage on the basis of a person's sexuality. The main purpose of this bill is not a complex one, Mr Speaker. It is to give same-sex couples in Australia the same right to marry the person they love as that which is currently only granted by law to heterosexual couples. We believe that when it comes to marriage equality, that time is now. The institution of marriage is about two people making a commitment to a monogamous relationship for life. Who is to say that one person's love for another person is in some way lesser because of their gender makeup? I certainly wouldn't have been introducing it if I didn't hope that I could have a vote on it. That's the first point I'm making. I mean, secondly, I'll certainly be following it through. I don't have the decision-making capacity in this, but the fact that I've put it in means I'd like to see it voted on the floor of the Parliament. I've already spoken to the Prime Minister after the party room and asked that I play a role in working through whatever the question is and what we're going to do in relation to the people's vote or whatever. And so that's all we can do at this point in time.
We're all here because we're representatives of the people. I would have liked a conscience vote to have gone to the House. That would have been my preferred choice. But in the end, we have a party process. We've gone through it. The Prime Minister allowed that to happen. But look, I will vote according to the liberties that are available to me as a backbencher always, and I will always represent the views of my constituent. I don't think you can ask representatives to do any more. And I respect that there are views across both our chamber and the opposite chamber in the House of Reps that are different.
Now, Tony Abbott wasn't in the building when Warren Entsch tabled his bill, but two other frontbenchers, Malcolm Turnbull and Christopher Pyne, did make a point of going into the chamber to watch it. From a police training centre on the fringes of Canberra, the Prime Minister says he respects Mr Entsch and is moving with his cabinet colleagues to give some clarity to the People's Choice process that was invented in last Tuesday night's long coalition meeting.
Obviously, my priority is jobs, growth and community safety. I absolutely respect the rights of members of parliament to bring private members' bills forward. And as you know, I've had a lot of discussions over quite a long period of time, over several years now, with Warren on this subject. And Warren certainly told me that he would be bringing his bill in this week, and I have nothing but respect for him. He is a terrific member of parliament and he's a great Australian. He's a close friend of mine.
Over the past few days, have you formed a view one way or another whether this should be a plebiscite or a referendum?
Well, the important thing is that it's got to be a people's choice. That's the important thing. It should be a people's choice. This is something that has been the way it currently is for thousands of years, hundreds of years. It's a very big decision to make a change like this. I don't say that it's not a decision that the community won't embrace ultimately, but the decision that came very strongly out of our party room last week was that this should not be the politician's decision, it should be the people's decision, and that's what will happen in the next term of Parliament. We're not going to dwell on this and we're not going to drag out the process, but no, what I think is that we've got a lot on our plate today, but very shortly we will finalise the precise process for going forward. But it will be a people's decision and it will be in the next term of Parliament.
Well, to look over same-sex marriage and other issues of the day, I'm joined in the studio now by the Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Stephen Chobo. And Stephen, you've been back in your electorate over the weekend after what was a pretty tumultuous week last week. What feedback are you getting about this people's choice? How eager voters are to express that choice and what type of choice they'll be offered?
Well, Greg, the feedback has been consistent. I was one of the people who argued within the coalition party room for there to be a plebiscite. I think this is one of the most fundamental aspects. It goes to the composition of marriages and indirectly, obviously, through that to the composition of our society. I do think this is the type of issue that warrants the people having their say. That was a viewpoint that I put forward inside the coalition party room. I'm really pleased that, along with other colleagues that argued for the merits of that the Prime Minister has picked up on that and run with it, and I think it ultimately is going to be in our nation's best interest that people have ownership of it.
You seem hard-pressed, or anyone would be hard-pressed, to find critics of the concept of a plebiscite. Where the quibbles exist, they seem to be around when and what the question might look like, or even whether it might be a referendum, which is an advance, I suppose, on a plebiscite. What's your view about timing? Is it feasible to have one before the next election?
Look, I don't think that's feasible. I also don't think it's desirable. I think that this is an important discussion. It's a dialogue that the Australian community should have ownership of. I mean, at the end of the day, the years that I've been involved in politics, Greg, I've never had anyone say to me, gee, we wish the politicians made more decisions and the people fewer. People consistently say to me that they think that it's a good thing for Australians to be able to have more ownership, more direct input into the democratic process. When you get to something as fundamental as marriage and its composition, when you get to something as fundamental as Australian society, I think it's appropriate that Australians should have their say.
OK, if not before the next election, in conjunction with?
Well, I think it should be a separate question because it doesn't need to be clouded with the issues of the day. I mean, there's two quite separate streams here. The government is focused on jobs. We're focused on the Australian economy and we're focused upon making sure that we are getting the nation's finances back on track. That's what this government is focused on. This issue in relation to same-sex marriage is an important issue, but it's separate to the government's priorities of the day, and I think it's appropriate that a separate question is asked in the next term of Parliament. Now the Prime Minister has flagged it.
And how do you stop this interfering with an election? If it is to be held sometime in the next term, how does it not become an election issue between now and then?
You know, I think Australians are smart. Australians understand that when they elect a government to do certain things. There's no doubt the next election will be a test of who has the best plans going forward to put our nation's finances back on track, to get more Australians employed in jobs, and to make sure that our economy continues to grow when there's a lot of economic headwinds. That's what people will be fighting the next election on, and that's what I think Australians will make their choice on. And I think that that's quite separate to an issue like this, which, sure, maybe for some Australians it is the biggest issue and they'll cast their vote on that. But I think for most Australians, they do see the issues as being separate.
So the Prime Minister says he'll try to settle a process in the next couple of weeks, was his description. Sure. What do you think that will look like, or what are you looking for from Cabinet? Something of a definite date in that next term of Parliament?
Well, I think the party room made clear its voice, and the party room's voice was, let's let all Australians have their say on this. As the Prime Minister has said, that the people have their say rather than the politicians, and I think that that's appropriate. So, look, Cabinet will be briefed up on, obviously, what it might involve, what the question options could be, all those types of matters, and I think in the fullness of time, a full and considered decision around that is appropriate. But, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with allowing the Australian people time to digest this, to talk about it, to have the debates about it, the pros and the cons, and ultimately to have their say.
And when the day does come, as someone who, I suppose, helped instigate all of this, what do you think comes first? Some sort of parliamentary stab at the question and then it goes off to the people to ratify, or the other way around? How do you think Parliament meshes in with the plebiscite?
Ultimately, there's always got to be a question formed, as everyone knows. So the process around how that question is formed, I don't believe is set in stone. I don't have firm views about it. I think what's important, though, is that Australians have that sense of ownership. I think the process should be transparent, it should be open to discussion, and no doubt people will want to be able to make their contribution to the formation of the question, as well as argue the merits in relation to change or not change as they see appropriate. And
Warren Edge, he tabled his private members bill today. I suppose he'd be an unwitting or unsuspecting father of this process. It rather unfolded quickly last week and beyond anyone's expectations, including your own.
Well, look, certainly it did. It caught, I don't want to say it caught people by surprise because the issue has been around for some time, but in terms of the legislative process, I think that caught some people by surprise. Look, I think it's great that Warren is pursuing with gusto something that he feels very strongly about. And the key point is this, on all sides of this debate, whether you're for or against, people have sincerity of views. I think that's a real positive. I think it's a strength to our democracy. And look, frankly, I think we should embrace the fact that as members of Parliament, we're able to get up to argue these points and then ultimately even reach the stage where we have now reached, where we say, look, the Australian people should have their say.
Well, if the people like the process that was invented last week, why do you think that's not showing through in some of the latest opinion polls as far as the government's overall standing is concerned?
I don't worry too much about the polls. I mean, you'll hear every member of Parliament say the only poll that matters is the poll on the day. The fact is that as a government, we want to remain focused on the task that we were elected to do. And that is exactly what this government is focused on, and most recently demonstrated by the Prime Minister's very strong focus, of course, in relation to Australia's ice epidemic. Now, why questions are asked the way that they're asked in terms of these polls, I'm not going to worry about. Others can discuss that.
Well, he's thrown the ice problem. National security is top of mind for the Prime Minister. He's thrown a budget at the people as well in recent months. And yet, would you use the word stubborn? Why is the number stubbornly low for the government?
I guess ultimately the Australian people determine how they think a government or an opposition is travelling. You know, we've all known, and you can't be in Parliament and in politics and not have realised that there's a level of dissatisfaction with all parliamentarians at the moment. In large part, much of it coming off, of course, the weeks of focus that's been on the entitlements debate. Ultimately, though, as we've seen throughout history, polling numbers don't always reflect what happens in elections. As a government, we remain focused on jobs, focused on the economy, and focused on restoring our nation's finances.
And can Tony Abbott turn that around?
Look, absolutely. As a government, I think if you focus on the fundamentals, if you do the job that Australians elected us to do, to repair the damage of 6 years of Labor's reckless spending, to actually focus on the fact that Aussies want to know that they've got a job and they've got job security, then I do believe that Australians will recognise that.
All right, Steve Chabot, thanks for that time today.
Pleasure, thanks.
Well, Stephen Chabot's boss, the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, in many ways his boss, has been speaking to the media. She's attended a Chamber of Commerce and Industry event down at the National Portrait Gallery here in Canberra. Here's what she had to say just a moment ago.
Clarify, do you prefer the idea of a referendum or a plebiscite when it comes to the issue of same-sex marriage?
My view is that a plebiscite would give every Australian who wanted to have a say on this matter a say. And so I think what is important is that the people have the opportunity to vote on what is a fundamental issue that affects our society. So it's an idea I spoke about in the party room last week, and of course we'll refine our thoughts closer to the time. But the contrast, of course, with Labor is Labor has no policy on same-sex marriage, none whatsoever. But what I would like to see is the coalition go to the next election, say vote for us, and you can have your say on marriage equality and same-sex marriage.
When should people have their say? Should it be before the next election, at the next election, or in the next term of parliament?
We'll talk about, but I think that it would be a good idea to go to the next election with that policy, because after all, we did say to the Australian people at the last election that our policy on changes to the Marriage Act would remain throughout this term, and if there was to be a change, it would go to the party room, as it did. And of course, this still has to be discussed by the party room, cabinet, the leadership.
But there is this.
Cabinet need to settle on this afternoon so we can see an end to this public bickering that's going on amongst cabinet colleagues.
Look, cabinet will deal with this when cabinet's ready to deal with it. And the fact is, if the bill introduced into the parliament today had been voted upon, it would not have got up, in my humble assessment. And so therefore, this is an issue that I think certainly draws a distinction between the coalition and Labor. We will say the people have a say, whereas Labor say they are the ones who will decide, but nobody will know what their position is until beyond 2019. A ridiculous situation.
Public bickering that's going on is going to affect the by-election in Canning?
I'm concerned that I was here at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry talking about free trade agreements and the huge opportunities for Australian businesses and jobs growth, and no one's asked me a question on it. That's what I'm worried about.
Doesn't that show that this issue is overshadowing important matters for the government?
Well, it might be in your mind, but it's certainly not in mine.
I have a diplomatic related question. The Indonesian ambassador today has called for Australia and Indonesia to put aside megaphone diplomacy. Do you think that's a good idea?
Absolutely, I agree entirely with him, and we have a very close relationship with Indonesian ministers. I spend a lot of time talking to my friend and colleague Retno Marsudi, the Foreign Minister of Indonesia, and I don't talk about it in the media. We had a very detailed contact over the weekend, and I've not put out a press release or shouted from the rooftops about it. That's the way Foreign Minister Marsudi and I operate, and I think it's working exceedingly well.
Will the Australian government be providing any assistance in terms of air crash investigators to the Indonesian plane crash?
We have made that offer to Indonesia. Our officials are talking, and most certainly that was the subject of my discussions, my contact with Foreign Minister Marsudi over the weekend, and our embassy in Jakarta is engaged with the Indonesian officials on this matter.
Minister, on today's Ipsos poll, how concerned are you that it shows that the government could potentially lose up to 36 seats if things don't change?
Well, we're focused on ensuring that the benefits of the policies that we've introduced are understood by the Australian public. Take, for example, the free trade agreements. Labor, through the unions, are waging a disgraceful campaign attacking China and the free trade agreement, when in actual fact this free trade agreement will provide enormous opportunities for Australians in the small, medium and large sectors of our economy, immense opportunities. So the benefits of these free trade agreements for jobs growth, for exporters, for the services sector, for the goods sector, are matters that we will continue to bring to the attention of the Australian public.
Before the prosecution of these cases, such as the free trade agreement and jobs and so forth, it doesn't appear to be biting with the electorate.
Well, if we are given the opportunity to talk about them at every press conference they do, that my colleagues do, well, I'm sure the Australian people will hear more about them. So that's why I'm talking to you and to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry about the benefits that will arise from the China, Korea and Japan free trade agreements with our country. The fact that my colleague Andrew Robb is pursuing a free trade agreement with India. We're enhancing our cooperation with Indonesia, with Singapore, with the Gulf cooperation countries, and of course the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which would, if implemented, realise a free trade zone across the Asia-Pacific. Most certainly a dream come true for Australian exporters.
I mean, it's sad to see that the female candidate president.
I am delighted that Andrew Hastie has been pre-selected as our candidate in Canning. This is a man who has dedicated years of his life serving this country, and he's now prepared to dedicate his life to serving the people of Canning. I think he makes an outstanding candidate. We do choose on merit. There was quite a wide field, but I am confident that Andrew Hastie will prove to be a most outstanding candidate in the next election, and I'm looking forward to supporting him in whatever way I can, because the people of Canning deserve a strong representative, a strong voice in Canning, as Don Randall was, and knowing Andrew Hastie, he will prove to be an outstanding representative for Canning and a fine addition to the Australian Parliament.
I mean, there's been a Wilson security guard who's worked on Nauru who's claimed that asylum seekers have been subjected to waterboarding. Do you think that that claim may damage Australia's bid for the United Nations Human Rights Council?
I have no understanding of the details of this. It's obviously a matter for the Minister of Immigration, and I'm not going to comment on a matter on which I'm not fully briefed.
Party at the weekend. What target would you like to see?
50%.
Do you think that's what the party will settle on?
Well, a target has to be achievable, but if you want Parliament to be representative of the composition of society, well, you'd want to have half the population represented. But our policy is merit-based. A target is something that you strive for, something that you seek to achieve. As long as we can continue to increase the number of women at each election, which is what the Prime Minister said would be our target, I think that's a great idea. And I certainly look forward to being part of the push to get more women into Parliament. I believe that formal and informal mentoring networks, for example, can assist in bringing more women into Parliament. So there are a number of things we can do, and I was delighted that the Prime Minister spoke about it over the weekend. Okay, I've got to go to question time. Thank you.
Well, a stony judicial silence has been broken at the Trade Union Royal Commission. Justice Dyson Hayden has, for the first time, given an explanation as to how he came to accept and then later reject an invitation to speak at a Liberal Party function. The explanation only came after the trade union movement sought to wheel a big gun lawyer into the Commission. And his brief, well, that was to argue that Justice Hayden might disqualify himself from the Commission. Here's how Dyson Hayden explained himself a short time ago.
To the best of my recollection, I had one or more informal discussions several years ago with the coordinator of the Sir Garfield Barwick address concerning the possibility of delivering the address at some future time. That address is something which, as I understand it, has been delivered annually for some years. On the 12th of June 2015, I received an email from the organiser to which was attached a copy of the invitation to the address, that being a 3-page document, as I say, attached to the email, a 1-page document. In the usual course, my personal assistant printed out a copy of the email and the attachments and provided them to me. I glanced through the email, noting the date, time and place of the dinner. I did not read the attachments. My understanding at all times has been that the dinner was not to be a fundraiser. Those are the matters of background I wanted to state so that the contents of MFI1 can be more clearly understood. I think in view of the time that's passed, Mr. Newlands, it might be best if we return to this at 1:30.
Yeah, that, of course I will, but I can say now I will not have instructions one way or the other as to making an application.
Mr. Newlands, you're a very able and experienced barrister. You understand the relevant law on this.
I do.
The facts are in a very small compass. you will be able to work out the content of some advice you might wish to give to your 4 clients. Let us return at 1:30 and examine what the position is then.
So that's how we got to this point, and ABC News 24 will be keeping an eye on that and bringing you the relevant moments when they happen. But we did hear in that exchange that Justice Dyson Hayden acknowledged that he didn't actually look at the attachments that had Liberal Party logos on them when he received the invitation to the Sir Garfield Barwick address just recently. And he did confirm that he knew back in 2014 that it was a Liberal Party event, but he had, to use his word, overlooked that when he considered it again in March of this year. Well, just to another matter now, politicians and the media have many tools of trade to get through a sitting week here in Parliament, but some pretty basics like rubber gloves and cleaning cloths and pegs aren't normally part of what we front up to work with. They are now, though, because industrial action by Parliament's cleaners means no toilet or bathroom in the building will be cleaned between now and Saturday morning, which is why they helpfully handed out the accoutrements to journalists and other occupants of the building. The cleaners want a small hourly pay increase to take their rate to just under $23 an hour.
During the winter break, the cleaners were here still working really hard when all the stories broke of the waste that the politicians were making. It's really distressing when you're only asking for a $1.80 pay increase an hour to hear of all these stories of waste. So we're asking the new Speaker, Tony Smith, to please fix this problem for us. He's fixing the waste, he said he would. He can also fix these cleaners' pay.